It's not every day a SWAT team-worthy police response rolls up to a backyard barbecue, but when flashing red and blue lights lit up my peaceful Saturday rib session, everyone froze, ribs midair, sauce on chins. My neighbor Karen had just called 911, screaming about suspicious smoke, dangerous noise, and illegal fire. She thought she was shutting me down. But the second the cops stepped out and shouted my name with a grin, followed by a "Yo! Got any ribs left?" Karen's smug smile turned into a dropped jaw that could have swallowed the whole brisket. She didn't know the officers were my high school best friends. That was her first mistake. And I had a feeling she was just getting started. The day had started perfectly. I had just finished a month-long renovation project on my backyard, and with the final touches in place, string lights, a polished wooden deck, new speakers installed, and a grill that looked like it belonged in a Michelin star kitchen, it was time to celebrate. I wasn't throwing a wild party, just inviting a few close friends and neighbors over for some smoked ribs, grilled corn, and sweet tea. It was one of those warm, lazy Saturdays that reminded you why you live in a suburb with trees and space. By 3 o'clock, the grill was sizzling, the jazz playlist was humming, and the scent of mesquite smoked meat danced in the breeze. Of course, in this HOA-governed neighborhood, happiness came with conditions, and the nosiest of those conditions was Karen. Karen lived 2 houses over, but somehow always seemed to have her binoculars locked onto my property line. She had reported my trash cans for being 1 inch too far out, she had measured my lawn with a literal ruler, and last winter, she once sent an email to the HOA board because I left my Christmas lights up until January 5th. This was the kind of woman who thought smiling dogs were a violation of noise decorum. At around 3:20 p.m., I saw her peeking over the fence, arms crossed, a sour expression carved permanently on her face. She didn't say anything at first. Just stood there like a villain reveal scene in a soap opera. I gave her a wave and a smile, holding up a rib like a peace offering. She didn't flinch. Instead, she stormed off back to her house like she'd just caught someone committing a felony with a spatula. 10 minutes later, I was turning the ribs when the music paused. My Bluetooth speaker disconnected. At first, I thought the battery died. Then I heard it. Sirens. 2 sets, maybe more. My friends at the table looked around confused, until we saw the unmistakable glow of red and blue lights bouncing through the wooden slats of my fence. For a split second, everyone froze like statues. Was there an emergency on the block? A medical situation? And then they pulled into my driveway. The scene that followed was surreal. 2 squad cars parked at the curb, lights flashing. My buddy Mike dropped his beer and stood up like he was about to lawyer up. Jessica, a neighbor, whispered that her cousin had been at a party busted like this. Then the officers stepped out. The first one was a tall, broad-shouldered guy in sunglasses. The second was laughing as he approached. Then I heard it. "Yo, Marcus? Is that you, bro?" the tall one called out. It was Officer Ricky, my old defensive tackle from high school football. And behind him was Dante, the class clown turned lawman. Before I could answer, they both walked right into my yard, fists extended for bro hugs. "No way," Ricky said, scanning the deck, the grill, the guests. "This the new setup you told me about last month?" Karen emerged like a specter from across the street, now armed with a printout of HOA rules and a phone pointed at the officers like she was recording a takedown. She shrieked about fire hazards, unregistered gatherings, and her constitutional right to clean air. Dante looked at her, then at me, and leaned in. "You owe me a rib for this call-out, man." The guests, catching on quickly, erupted in laughter. Mike clapped. Jessica raised her plastic cup in salute. Ricky turned back to Karen. "Ma'am," he said with professional restraint, "this is not an emergency. There's no crime being committed here." Karen's face began to twitch. "But he's burning meats. The smoke is hazardous." Ricky calmly explained that backyard grilling was not against city code, nor was playing jazz at a reasonable volume, and calling 911 for something that wasn't even close to an emergency? That could be a finable offense. Karen turned pale. For a moment I thought she might faint. This is harassment, she screeched. This is a conspiracy. Against what? Dante chuckled. Sauce. Karen stormed off again, clearly not expecting the cops to know my dog's name, let alone ask if I still make that spicy coleslaw they love. As she disappeared behind her front door, Ricky turned to me. You know she's called us 6 times in the last 2 months? He said under his breath. One was for a neighbor whose dog barked in a threatening tone. It was a lot funnier once we realized we weren't getting arrested. But I knew Karen. This wouldn't be the end of it. Sure enough, the next morning, there was a letter taped to my front door from the HOA board. A formal warning about unauthorized gatherings. I chuckled. No official rule broken. Just a passive-aggressive warning signed by Karen W. HOA Compliance Committee. I grabbed a coffee and walked to my porch. Across the street, Karen was already outside with a clipboard, surveying her domain. Our eyes met. She didn't smile. Neither did I. But inside I grinned. Because if she thought a barbecue was where this ended, she was in for a 5-course meal of consequences. I had friends. I had footage. And now I had motivation. The battle had been lit. And this time, she wasn't the one holding the match. The warning letter didn't shock me, but it did set the tone. Taped to my door like a ransom note, the paper was aggressively worded yet comically vague, claiming I had violated community regulations regarding unsanctioned activity, whatever that meant. It was signed by none other than Karen W., who had clearly wasted no time weaponizing her HOA status. I took it down slowly, not out of respect, but more because I wanted to avoid giving her the satisfaction of seeing me react. But deep inside, I already knew, this wasn't going to be some minor neighborhood disagreement. Karen was turning it into a war. That Monday evening, a neighbor named Ben stopped by. He was a quiet guy, usually kept to himself, but that day he looked irritated. He held up an envelope he'd just pulled from his mailbox, another warning letter, this one for cluttered yard decor. The man had 2 garden gnomes. That was it. I showed him mine, and we exchanged looks of mutual understanding. Karen wasn't just targeting me, she was on a power trip, and anyone who didn't fall in line was apparently fair game. That's when I realized her antics weren't just annoying, they were creating fear, division, and stress in the very community she claimed to protect. I decided to attend the next HOA board meeting. Not to argue or grandstand, but just to observe. The meeting was held in the community center, a sterile beige room with flickering fluorescent lights and a long folding table at the front where the board sat. Karen, of course, presided like a smug monarch. She opened the meeting with a warm welcome that would have sounded genuine if her tone wasn't dripping with condescension. When it came time to discuss community complaints, Karen cleared her throat and read from a sheet in front of her. She began with an uptick in smoke-related disturbances, which was clearly about me. Then she transitioned into complaints about unregulated gatherings, potential fire hazards, and community unrest caused by disruptive elements. Every word she said was vague enough to avoid being directly challenged, yet sharp enough to target someone. I raised my hand calmly and asked what specific regulations had been violated. She smiled a tight-lipped smile and replied, "Well, it's more about the spirit of the rules than the letter." That told me everything I needed to know. She was using ambiguity as a weapon. If it wasn't in the handbook, she simply decided it was in the spirit of the rules. After the meeting, a few neighbors approached me in the parking lot, quietly complaining that they too had received warnings, some for laughable infractions like using blue LED lights or parking their car a few inches over their own property line. It was clear Karen had transformed her position into a mini dictatorship, and now she was expanding her reach. The next incident was almost surreal. On a warm Wednesday afternoon, I was out back cleaning my grill when I noticed a man walking through my side yard holding a clipboard. He wore a little HOA badge, barely visible, and said he was there to survey potential code violations. I asked if he had a warrant or even a permission slip. He muttered something about HOA policy giving them the right to perform visual inspections from common areas. I reminded him that my side yard was not a common area. He left after I told him he was being recorded. Later, I checked my security camera footage and saw him taking photos of my yard like he was gathering evidence for a federal case. By Friday, I had received 2 more violations, one for excessively tall grass, and one for unregistered outdoor fixtures. The grass? Cut 2 days earlier. The fixtures? Solar lights from Home Depot. Nothing about them violated any known rule. It became obvious that Karen was instructing her lackeys to go door to door looking for anything she could twist into a complaint. At this point, I wasn't mad. I was intrigued. Because when people get this desperate for control, they always make mistakes. And I was patient enough to wait for one. My friends Ricky and Dante, now dubbed the BBQ cops by my neighbors, came by that weekend. I filled them in on the growing pattern of harassment. Ricky shook his head and told me to start documenting everything in detail. Every warning, every letter, every visit. Dante told me they'd already received 2 more non-emergency complaints linked to Karen in the past week alone. She was rapidly building a paper trail without realizing she was doing me a favor. I upgraded my security setup. Motion cameras, doorbell cams, time-stamped recordings. I even installed a small dash cam on my car pointed at the front lawn. I wasn't paranoid, I was building a case. Every time Karen's inspector walked by, I logged it. When a violation arrived in the mail, I scanned and time-stamped it. I even started a folder titled Operation Smokeout. The name was mostly for my own amusement, but it also reminded me to treat this situation with tactical focus. Then came the call that made it personal. I had just finished helping my neighbor Susan install a rainwater collection system when she burst into tears on her porch. She'd just gotten a warning for unpermitted construction, citing the barrel system. But the system had been encouraged by the city's environmental office and was part of a state-funded conservation grant. Karen had gone too far. Susan was elderly, lived alone, and just wanted to lower her water bill. Watching her shake in frustration over a plastic barrel made something click inside me. Karen wasn't just annoying. She was damaging people's lives under the illusion of maintaining standard. She was using rules as weapons, and people like Susan were collateral damage. That was the moment I decided I wouldn't just defend myself, I'd take action for everyone she'd tried to silence. I met with Ricky again the next day, this time not at a barbecue but at his precinct. We sat down and went through the documentation. He was stunned by the scope of it. Multiple calls, false reports, abuse of HOA power, even possible mail fraud if she was misrepresenting official warnings. Dante walked in halfway through and said with a grin, "If Karen's playing HOA God, she's about to meet the full force of accountability." Ricky suggested I file a formal complaint to the HOA Oversight Committee, an external board that handles ethics violations in homeowner associations. But I told him I had something better in mind. Filing a complaint would be necessary, but what I wanted was public accountability. Karen had used silence, intimidation, and bureaucracy to get her way. So, I'd use community, transparency, and humor to take it back. The plan was still forming in my head, but I knew the goal wasn't just to stop Karen. It was to expose her with such clarity that no HOA board would dare back her again. And while she sat in her living room planning her next citation, I was planning something that would flip her entire playbook upside down. Because this wasn't just about a barbecue anymore. It was about every gnome, umbrella, and rain barrel she'd ever tried to erase. And by the time I was finished, Karen wouldn't just be off the board, she'd be the reason everyone showed up to vote. Ask ChatGPT. Karen had made her move with warnings and petty citations, but now it was my turn. I didn't want revenge that would blow back on the neighborhood. I wanted a solution that exposed her hypocrisy while strengthening the community. That's when I remembered a suggestion Dante had thrown out during one of our many backyard chats. He'd said, half-jokingly, that if Karen hated my barbecues so much, I should throw one so big, so legitimate, and so public that she wouldn't be able to stop it. That little joke lit the fuse of my idea. I was going to flip Karen's obsession with control into her downfall by using the very system she worshipped. I started by reaching out to local small businesses, especially the ones that supplied food, drinks, and event services. There was a veteran-owned meat shop downtown that specialized in smoked brisket and ribs. I told them what I was planning and why. They offered to donate meat and help with prep. Then I talked to a local beverage company that produced craft sodas. They were all in. The mayor's assistant, whom I'd worked with on a city park project 2 years ago, confirmed that as long as permits were secured and the event had a charity component, they'd consider attending in support. That was the hook. I decided to turn the barbecue into a fundraising event for first responders. The name came to me in an instant: Neighbors Not Noise. The planning kicked into high gear. I filed the necessary permits with the city. I submitted a community event request to the HOA, knowing full well Karen would try to block it. The difference this time was that I filed it under the clause that guaranteed homeowners the right to host community-enhancing events if they served charitable purposes and included at least 3 confirmed sponsors. I had 5. The HOA couldn't legally reject it, and if they did, they'd be in violation of their own bylaws. I printed out every rule, every line of fine print, and prepared for battle. Predictably, the pushback came fast. Karen called an emergency HOA session and demanded that my event be classified as a disturbance risk. She said that smoke-related trauma was a concern among residents and even cited a fake statistic about respiratory incidents increasing during cookouts. One board member, a quiet older gentleman named Ed, finally spoke up and asked if there was any actual data to support her claims. Karen dodged the question by trying to pivot to noise complaints. She got visibly frustrated when I calmly laid out every section of the HOA bylaws that protected what I was doing. I even had printed copies for each board member. She tried to interrupt, but Ed raised his hand and said the rules were clear. Her objection was overruled. For the first time, Karen looked shaken. With the green light secured, I spent the next 2 weeks finalizing the details. Flyers went out. Neighbors volunteered to help set up tables and string lights. People donated chairs, tents, speakers, and desserts. I installed a giant banner at the entrance of the neighborhood that read, "Neighbors Not Noise, a community barbecue for our first responders." I made sure the names of the guests of honor were listed in bold. Police, firefighters, paramedics, and yes, Ricky and Dante were on the list. Karen would be furious, and that was half the fun. The morning of the event arrived, and the sun was already shining like it knew the occasion was special. I started setting up at 8 a.m., and by 10, volunteers were arranging tables and stringing up decorations. Dante and Ricky showed up early with their squad cars, parking them out front like proud mascots of the party. Ricky even brought his wife and 2 kids, who immediately took over the bouncy house we'd set up on the side yard. My backyard, once a battlefield of petty HOA conflict, was now filled with laughter, grill smoke, and music. Karen didn't appear at first, but I knew she was watching. Her blinds were drawn, but every now and then they shifted slightly, just enough to reveal the glare of binoculars or a phone lens. At noon, we kicked off the event with a brief speech thanking the first responders for their service. I handed out plates of ribs and wings like a king feeding his court. People I'd never even spoken to before were shaking hands, sharing stories, and laughing like old friends. It was everything I had wanted this neighborhood to be. Then, like clockwork, Karen arrived. She didn't walk into the backyard. She marched to the sidewalk with her arms crossed and a stack of papers in her hands. She was dressed in what I could only describe as court-ready attire, as if she expected a lawsuit to erupt mid-hot dog. She started taking photos from the edge of my property, walking up and down the fence line muttering to herself. Finally, she approached Ricky, who was helping pour lemonade for a couple of kids. This next part was the most surreal thing I'd ever seen. Karen tried to lodge an in-person complaint to Officer Ricky. She accused the event of being a coordinated act of disruption, claimed that unauthorized use of emergency symbols on the banner was impersonation of law enforcement, and then waved a laminated HOA document like a sword. Ricky let her speak, nodded politely, and then responded by offering her a plate of brisket. She looked so stunned she didn't even reply. He added, in his calm police voice, that the event was not only legal, but honored by the city, and that if she continued to harass people or disrupt the gathering, she could be cited for disorderly conduct. Karen sputtered and walked away, defeated for now. But as she turned the corner, I saw her making a phone call. I knew she wouldn't give up that easily. Sure enough, 20 minutes later, a city inspector showed up. Karen had called the fire marshal's office claiming we were operating unregulated open flames near residential structures. But she didn't realize the fire marshal himself was invited. The inspector chuckled, waved at me, and walked straight over to the grill. He complimented the setup, grabbed a burger, and stayed for the rest of the event. Every attempt Karen made to derail the day backfired magnificently. By 4 o'clock, the mayor's assistant had shown up with a local news reporter in tow. They interviewed neighbors, praised the event's turnout, and even took a group photo with the first responders. The event became a mini-sensation. Trended on local social media. People tagged their posts with hashtag BBQ Justice and hashtag KarenFreeZone. It was the exact public accountability I'd envisioned, amplified by laughter, community, and grilled corn on the cob. Later that evening, after the crowd dispersed and we were cleaning up, I noticed something stuck to my front door again. But this time it wasn't a warning. It was a letter from the city thanking me for organizing the event. It mentioned that several complaints had been filed during the day, but that each one had been deemed false or retaliatory. The letter also informed me that the city had initiated a review of Karen's previous complaints for potential abuse of municipal services. I sat on my porch as the sun dipped below the rooftops, the smell of barbecue still hanging in the air. Kids were chasing each other across the street. Neighbors who barely spoke to each other a month ago were now trading leftover desserts. Ricky and Dante came out one last time, clinking soda cans with me in a silent toast. Karen's window remained shut, blinds as. I woke up the next morning still smelling smoke on my clothes, ribs in my fridge, and victory in the air. The event had gone better than I ever imagined. People were talking, laughing, bonding. The neighborhood had finally felt like a community again. But I also knew Karen wasn't the type to take a loss lightly. I had embarrassed her in front of the entire street, turned her desperate call for control into a block-wide celebration, and reduced her laminated HOA citations to nothing more than a running joke. She would come back swinging, and I had to be ready. It didn't take long. By Tuesday afternoon, a new letter was dropped at my door. This time it wasn't just another vague violation. It was a formal request to appear at the next HOA hearing, citing me for willful endangerment of public safety and unauthorized public gathering that misrepresented community leadership. I nearly laughed at how desperate it sounded. But then I noticed something new. Attached to the letter was a document marked Exhibit A, a blurry photo of me flipping ribs, with smoke rising in the background and a red circle around the flames, as if to suggest danger. It looked like it had been printed from a phone at 200% zoom. It was ridiculous, but it showed me something important. Karen wasn't just retaliating. She was building a case, or at least trying to, even if it was made of wet paper. I called Ricky and showed him the letter. He wasn't surprised. In fact, he told me the city had received 5 additional complaints from Karen over the last 3 days, each more exaggerated than the last. She'd claimed the event was a front for a political protest. She'd said people were drinking publicly on the sidewalk. She even accused Ricky of being biased due to a conflict of personal history. But every claim had been dismissed. The city was keeping a record now. It wasn't just neighborly annoyance anymore, it was evidence. Still, I decided it was time to play offense. Karen had built her power not just through noise, but through silence. Most neighbors either ignored her or grumbled quietly. No one stood up to her because they didn't want to be targeted. That fear was what kept her in control. So I started knocking on doors. At first, people were hesitant. Some even whispered while talking, as if Karen might be listening through the walls. But once I explained what I was doing, something changed. I wasn't asking people to fight. I was asking them to speak, to share their stories, to show that she wasn't just targeting me. Within a week, I had over a dozen written testimonies. A single mom named Lila, who got fined for having a swing set without community color matching. A veteran who got a letter about his flagpole being too prominent. A renter who received 3 warnings for unauthorized window coverings, all within the first week of moving in. I scanned everything, documented dates, cross-checked stories. Then I found something that made my jaw tighten. 2 years ago, Karen had used HOA funds to install a decorative front gate for her home. The expense had been buried in a maintenance invoice, listed as Common Area Enhancement. I confirmed with the treasurer, who had no idea that money went to a private residence. That's when I knew it wasn't just about petty power. It was corruption. I reached out to the state's HOA Ethics Committee. It's a little-known office that reviews abuse cases, and while they rarely intervene, they do investigate patterns. I sent them everything. The letters, the footage, the testimonies, the misused funds. I wasn't sure what would come of it, but at the very least, it created pressure. And sometimes, pressure is all it takes to crack a facade. But I didn't stop there. I also created an anonymous neighborhood flyer titled The Truth About Karen. It didn't include insults or personal attacks. It simply laid out facts, direct quotes, and examples. I dropped it in every mailbox, careful not to post anything on public walls or mailboxes to avoid technical violation. The response was immediate. By the end of the day, my phone buzzed non-stop. Some thanked me. Others told me their own stories. A few even apologized for staying quiet so long. Karen's reign wasn't just weakening. It was collapsing. Then came the HOA meeting. The same beige community center. The same flickering lights. But this time, nearly every seat was filled. Karen walked in wearing a stiff navy suit like she was attending court. She held a thick folder in her hands, and her expression was a tight, forced calm. I sat near the front, holding a folder of my own, calm but focused. When the meeting opened, Karen took the floor, listing off her complaints against me, citing everything from barbecue smoke affecting vegetation to hostile social campaigns undermining board cohesion. Her voice was steady, but her eyes darted around nervously. When it was my turn to speak, I stood and read calmly from a prepared statement. I didn't attack her. I didn't raise my voice. I just laid out the facts: patterned harassment, fabricated citations, city dismissals, financial misuse. I presented the letters from other residents, including 3 from people in the room. Then I mentioned the Ethics Committee report, which had officially launched an investigation into board conduct. The room fell silent. Ed, the older board member who had once questioned Karen's smoke complaint, leaned forward and asked one question. "Is this all documented?" I handed him a flash drive and a printed summary. Karen tried to interject, but Ed held up a hand. "Let him finish," he said. And I did. At the end of the meeting, a motion was raised to vote on Karen's removal from the board pending investigation. To everyone's surprise, including mine, it passed overwhelmingly. Karen stood, mouth open, clutching her folder as if it could still shield her. But it was over. As she left the room, people actually clapped. Not for me but for each other. For speaking up. In the days that followed, things moved quickly. Karen received an official notice from the Ethics Committee, advising her to step down during the ongoing inquiry. She refused. Then she received another from the city, related to her misuse of public services. That one came with a fine. Ricky texted me a screenshot of it. Karen tried to argue it, of course, but the evidence was solid. Even her HOA allies began to distance themselves. And me? I didn't stop working. The moment Karen was suspended, I was nominated to fill her seat temporarily. I hesitated at first, not wanting to become what I had fought against. But the community needed direction. So I accepted. My first act was to repeal every rule she had pushed in the last 2 years that wasn't supported by community vote. We reinstated open gatherings, removed ridiculous cosmetic restrictions, and created a transparency portal where residents could see exactly where their fees were going. We even hosted a community dinner, potluck style, on the same lawn Karen once tried to control with a ruler. She still lived in the neighborhood for now. But her power was gone. Her hold over people had evaporated. I occasionally saw her peering out her window, watching as kids played in sprinklers and neighbors barbecued openly on their front lawns. She never came out, and no one asked her to. You'd think after being removed from the HOA board, fined by the city, and investigated by the ethics committee, Karen would have the good sense to lie low. But Karen wasn't wired like most people. Humiliation didn't quiet her down, it just made her more desperate. And when desperate people have nothing left to lose, they tend to get reckless. I knew she'd try something again. I just didn't expect how far she'd go. It started with whispers. A neighbor told me Karen had been seen handing out flyers downtown, not in the neighborhood but near the city offices and local businesses. Then I got a text from my buddy at the town clerk's office. He snapped a blurry photo of a document Karen had submitted. It was a complaint addressed to the mayor's office, accusing me of abusing my temporary HOA role, misusing city partnerships for self-glorification, and worst of all, creating a hostile social environment through unauthorized community events. I almost choked on my coffee when I read that last part. Apparently, her problem now wasn't that the barbecue broke rules. Her new spin was that it had psychologically scarred her and created an environment of public shame. As absurd as it sounded, Karen had filed it with official signatures from 2 people, former allies from the HOA board who had quietly resigned after the vote but were now clearly trying to save face. But what really got my attention was the final page of the packet. It included edited photos from the event, taken wildly out of context. One was a shot of Ricky standing in uniform next to me, captioned to suggest he was improperly endorsing my leadership. Another showed kids near the grill, with the angle skewed to imply they were too close to open flames. She even photoshopped in a label that read Unauthorized Public Access Zone. It was so bad it bordered on comedy, but it was clear she was trying to trigger some kind of formal review. I didn't panic. Instead, I called the mayor's assistant directly. She laughed so hard I had to hold the phone away from my ear. She told me the entire office had seen the complaint and couldn't believe Karen thought it would hold weight, especially after the media had covered the event as a positive example of grassroots neighborhood unity. She assured me no action would be taken. Still, I asked for a copy of the entire report and filed it away. At this point, I had enough documentation to start my own Netflix series. But Karen wasn't done. Not even close. A few days later, she started planting rumors on the neighborhood Facebook group, subtle at first. She posted vague concerns about financial mismanagement under the new HOA leadership. Then she claimed there was proof that the community funds were being used to host exclusionary events. She never mentioned my name, but it was clear who she was targeting. I didn't reply. I let other neighbors do the talking, and to my surprise, they did. People called her out, posted screenshots, reminded others what really happened. Still, she pushed. She posted screenshots of the barbecue flyer, this time with fake annotations in red like she was analyzing crime scene evidence. It would have been funny if it wasn't so utterly deranged. Then, the final move came. I woke up one morning to find a glossy envelope in my mailbox. Inside was a letter addressed to the entire community, styled like a legal notice. It stated that a lawsuit was being considered against me for harassment, emotional distress, and defamation. The letter was filled with legal jargon and citations, most of which didn't apply or were grossly misused. At first glance, it looked serious, but a deeper read revealed it was nonsense. There was no law firm header, no lawyer signature, just Karen's name and a printout of text copied from some online legal site. It was a bluff, a scare tactic, but I knew I had to respond carefully. So I took it to a real lawyer, one who lived just a few streets over. He laughed for about 30 seconds before getting serious and drafting a cease and desist letter of our own. It was polite but firm, listing every false accusation, every piece of defamatory content, and every instance of targeted harassment Karen had committed. We hand-delivered the letter, with a witness present, and also sent a copy via certified mail. Karen didn't answer the door, but the look on her face as she opened the envelope from her window said everything. That was the last real move she made. Maybe it was the cease and desist that did it. Maybe she realized she'd burned every bridge she once used to rule the block. Or maybe she finally just ran out of bad ideas. Whatever the reason, she went silent. The Facebook posts stopped. The complaints stopped. The blinds on her windows stayed shut. The neighbors called it the retreat. I called it long overdue peace. With Karen finally out of the picture, the neighborhood transformed. We held a community cleanup day. Over 30 families showed up. People brought tools, snacks. Kids played in the cul-de-sac while adults painted fences and mulched flower bed. It was simple, pure, and exactly what a neighborhood should feel like. I looked around at all the smiles and thought about how far we'd come. Not just from a messy backyard conflict, but from a place where fear and silence once ruled. At the next HOA election, I stepped down. I hadn't signed up for the role permanently and never intended to hold power. I nominated Ed, the wise old board member who'd always ask the right questions, and he won in a landslide. I stayed involved, but from the background. I didn't want a title. I just wanted my neighborhood to stay free from pettiness, fear, and fake citations. The last time I saw Karen was a few weeks later. She was loading a box into the trunk of her car. The for sale sign on her lawn had just been taken down. She didn't wave. She didn't look angry either. Just tired. Maybe even a little hollow. I didn't wave either. I just watched quietly as she closed her trunk, got in, and drove away. No ceremony. No final tantrum. Just the quiet departure of someone who had finally realized she no longer controlled the stage. That evening, Ricky and Dante came over. No uniforms, no cruisers, just two old friends with folding chairs and cold drink. We sat in the yard, surrounded by the scent of freshly cut grass and grilled leftovers. The sun was setting behind the rooftops, casting that golden-orange glow over the fence line. We didn't talk about Karen. We didn't need to. We just sat in peace. Sometimes, justice doesn't come in the form of a courtroom verdict or a public apology. Sometimes, it looks like neighbors laughing over lemonade, kids drawing chalk dragons on the sidewalk, and a block free from fear. Sometimes, the best victory is the one where everyone gets to enjoy their backyard without worrying about binoculars and laminated warnings. The war Karen started with a 911 call over a barbecue ended with community, laughter, and a new chapter for our street. And even now, every time someone lights a grill, turns up the music, or waves to a passing patrol car, it feels like a quiet tribute to how we got here. No drama. No shouting. Just ribs, resilience, and the reminder that sometimes, the people who try to silence you only make your voice louder.